Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. Today, we're going to return to some of the new content that's come out with the Pale Garden drop, the Garden Awakens drop. We're going to take a look at Pale Moss today, and in fact, I only have one block of Pale Moss in my possession right now, whereas I have plenty of regular good old green moss, because we've used this in previous occasions for a bit of landscaping, a bit of moss mining, which is the subject of today's video, and a few other bits and pieces. So moss is a really useful tool for digging down in large areas because it makes most blocks insta-mineable. Now, a lot of blocks, like the surface blocks that you're finding around here, are going to be insta-mineable anyway, thanks to having a shovel that is over efficiency 4. You can just strip away all of the grass blocks around here. And of course, once you get down to stone layers, the beacon that's in there provides haste for me in this area if I want to do any large-scale digging. But below that, you encounter deep slate, and deep slate is a tricky block to get rid of with speed because, of course, you don't get to insta-mine it even if you have the most efficient tools in survival and a haste beacon running nearby. So instead, my tool of choice is moss, which can spread to natural blocks like deep slate and make it the kind of block that you can instantly mine out with a hoe. And I don't think it even needs to be a hoe enchanted with efficiency, although a lot of the hoes that I'm using will be enchanted with that simply because I got it in the process of getting unbreaking, which we will definitely need because we're going to be breaking a lot of blocks with these tools. But in the process of moss mining, your inventory will fill up with a lot of additional blocks, because not only do you get the moss blocks and the moss carpet that generates, you also get wheat seeds thanks to the fact that tall grass will grow, and you will also find yourself with Azalea saplings, which is where I think pale moss might actually prove a really useful tool for this kind of mining. It has the edge over regular moss because it does not generate those Azalea saplings. It will still generate tall grass and moss carpet, but it clogs your inventory with 2 fewer things, because Azalea and flowering Azalea will both generate from regular moss blocks. So I'm wondering to myself, can we measure how quickly you can take care of an area with pale moss mining down from a high chunk all the way down to bedrock, compared to regular moss? Is there going to be a significant difference? Is getting rid of the Azalea and just having pale moss, carpet, and seeds going to streamline the process of moss mining, or is it kind of a negligible benefit? In addition to that, along the way, when I'm moss mining out a chunk, I typically throw the Azalea, carpets, and wheat seeds all into a composter that provides extra bone meal for me to continue moss mining out the chunk. Without that Azalea, are we still going to break even on bone meal? Are we going to get less bone meal as a result and have to dip into our reserves of bone blocks in order to get the job done? That's what I'm trying to find out. So, armed with a little bit more pale moss now, we're going to take both of these over to a chunk, and I think we're going to start by moss mining out a chunk, and then we're going to pale moss mine out a chunk adjacent to that and measure them. I feel like a lot of this evidence is going to be anecdotal. It's going to be really about feel more than it is about the statistics of all of this, but I'm going to try and time myself with each chunk as well, as accurately as I can, because obviously I'll have to take breaks and go and repair tools and that kind of thing, but I will try my best to start and stop the timer whenever I'm away from the chunk, whenever I'm not actively involved in the activity of moss mining, and we'll see how well we do. I'm also going to challenge myself to gather 2 shulker boxes of both types of material, mostly so I can get hold of a bulk supply of the pale moss block instead of just composting all of it as I go, but also so we can have some extra moss in reserve. Even though we have lots of it in storage, it's really useful for landscaping, and I'm sure we'll end up using it some other time. And fortunately for me, since the current area I'm working on builds in is a fairly mountainous one, I have an ideal place picked out to start moss mining. And that is, of course, over here at the Windy City, where we built the resin farm, where we've built our gateway recently. There are a couple of mountains surrounding the town, but the one I want to start digging out is beyond that, mostly because it's out of the way, it's out of render distance of the town, and I wanted a slightly flatter area from which to begin. So we're going to pick a couple of chunks of this snowy slopes biome, which is still a mountain biome, so there is still a chance for me to get emerald ore in the process, and you folks know I love my emerald ore. But alighting on this mountain top, it seems like we can probably pick out a couple of chunks of this that are of a similar height, and then there will be a little bit less bias to introduce in terms of the height of the chunk, and it means that we don't have to dig all the way from a mountain that gets up to the maximum height, all the way down to bedrock from there, which should make things a little bit easier. We're starting at Y144 though, so down to -64. There's still about 200 layers between us and the bedrock right now, but I think it should be nice and easy to make a start. So let's pick out this chunk here and maybe the chunk immediately neighboring it. Those look like they've got roughly the same sort of terrain in each. We're going to outline the moss mining chunk in spruce wood, and we're going to outline the pale moss mining chunk in pale oak wood. Oh my gosh, do we have a screaming goat here? I just heard this goat make a noise, and it was definitely a scream. Yep, no, that's a screaming goat. Okay, well, minor diversion. Goats come in two varieties. They are the regular kind or the screaming kind. And the screaming kind can actually give you some special goat horns if you get rammed by one of them and it misses and hits a solid block nearby. So I'm actually going to do the rhyming thing and put this goat in a boat because I have a feeling we'll need to keep hold of this one, and there's also an advancement for putting a goat in a boat and floating with it. So that's going to be a hilarious soundtrack to my moss mining experiment here, but we might as well get this show on the road. So I'm going to finish outlining this. We're going to start digging down with moss, and I'm going to do this on a live stream. So I'll see you folks on the other side, where hopefully we should have some results. And already this feels like a pretty monumental effort. I'm just checking in at the 2/3 point, really, because we have moss mined our way all the way down to, I think, -3. Right here, we are just about hitting caves in the deep slate layers. We're getting rid of the last of this decorative stone here and there. I've already acquired a bunch of ore and a bunch of other materials that I'm storing in these two shulker boxes, and everything else is getting composted at this point because I got my 2 shulkers of moss, so we fulfilled that requirement of the activity. I put about 4 hours into this chunk so far, and so I'm expecting it to take another 2 to get to the bottom of this hole, and then we'll see if it takes us 6 hours to dig out the neighboring chunk, considering that it doesn't look like there's a ton of caves. I did trip a skulk sensor somewhere around this corner though, so I have a feeling we'll probably encounter the deep dark sooner or later, and for all I know there's an ancient city underneath this because we did start underneath a mountain biome. But it's time to start spreading the moss again. I will check in one more time when we've reached the bottom of this chunk, or as far down as I can go, depending on how dangerous it gets. Because yeah, having just checked the biome on the left-hand side there, we are in deep dark, technically, which I guess means no mob spawns, but it could also mean a lot of wardens. I'm going to keep digging with the green stuff, and I'll see you on the other side when we're ready to start a chunk with pale moss. Okay, a little while later, we are just about finishing up here. We've hit a layer of bedrock, and I've cleared out the ores on this layer, and I think that's as far down as I want to go. I don't want to take out all of the blocks in between, because we'd just be doing that with moss anyway. So, we have a few more things left to compost. I think that's actually just finished up, which is great, because I want to grab all of the bone meal out of here, and we're going to see how many bone blocks we get back out of that as part of the data that we've been gathering about this moss mining chunk. So here we go. I'll briefly show you the ores. This is not really going to matter all that much as far as moss versus pale moss is concerned, but I always like to get a little bit of loot, and we got 12 deep slate diamond ore out of this chunk. We got a decent amount of the other ores, obviously a ton of copper. This actually went through a layer that was supposed to be part of the dripstone caves biome, but I didn't actually encounter any dripstone caves, fortunately for me, because that would have meant a potential fall onto pointed dripstone. But either way, got a bunch of different precious materials out of this. We only got 1 emerald ore. I actually saw more emerald ore up in the walls than I did actually acquiring out of this chunk, but not to worry, we could go back and get those later if we really wanted them to. And no deep slate emerald. I think possibly even because we hit the deep dark biome, and at that point, technically speaking, the deep slate layer didn't count as a mountain biome, and mountains are the only ones that generate emerald ore. So it's actually possible that the amount of deep slate emerald ore in the world is lessened by how many mountains the deep dark biome starts relatively high up underneath. But that's just me being a fiend for deep slate emerald ore. That's nothing to do with any of this, really. What we've got to consider is the time that we spent mining out this chunk. I spent 5 hours and 30 minutes total. Came in a little bit under estimate in the end there, but yeah, 5 hours and 30 minutes to mine this entire thing from, what was it, we started at Y144, something like that, all the way down to bedrock at, what is this, -59. So yeah, roughly 200 layers in that. During that time, I wouldn't say the azalea saplings really got in my way, but I did accidentally grow 4 azalea saplings into full-size trees. You can see that here in the miscellaneous resources box where I've got the oak logs from those azalea trees, which I guess could be useful for making chests and whatnot, but aside from the other material in here, which is stuff that I use to mine out the side here where I was placing the composters, and a lot of gravel which can't be converted into moss, so has to remain as it is. We had a relatively convenient trip down here thanks to the moss just stripping away the layers of deep slate. The other thing we want to concern ourselves with is the return on investment for bone meal. I actually started this out with like a loose stack of bone meal that I think amounted to about 2 or 3 bone blocks, and then I gave myself basically an additional half stack of bone blocks. So I'd say maybe we had 35-ish bone blocks to start off with, and now having finished up here, I don't have any more in my bundle or anything, so that is now coming out to roughly 2 stacks of bone blocks returned. So we definitely had enough bone meal to keep us going, even though I've actually saved 2 shulker boxes worth of moss blocks in the process of mining out this chunk. I was able to do that relatively early, and we've always been generating more bone meal than we put into this project. So generally speaking, it's going to generate a fair amount of bone meal. So now I'm going to pack down the composting setup, we're going to set it up on the opposite side of this neighboring chunk, and we're going to do this whole thing again. I've actually spotted a couple of segments of this that I'm looking forward to digging on down through, and I've patched up a couple of the walls here and there where there is definitely a skulk cave underneath that, but as you can see, we didn't run into any wardens or deep darks or ancient cities or anything like that, so fortunately it's been pretty plain sailing. Hopefully the pale moss chunk will be kind of similar. In the meantime, our goat has acquired a friend. There's 2 goats in here now. I can't even remember which one is technically the screaming one. I guess we'll have to find out when we remove them from the boat. But yes, unfortunately, it did snow whilst I was doing this, and I realized that that was going to impact the time it took us to mine out the chunk, so I placed this glass roof over the top, dotted it with torches to make sure that the snow didn't completely block the light down there at the lower region of the world, and now I have to strip off this top layer of snow before we can really get started mining. But before we do that, I'm actually going to use some of the wood from these Azalea trees to make a couple of double chests. We can use those to drop off all the miscellaneous resources we got, and then I'll probably end up reusing the shulker boxes for the next dig. We'll set all of the ores to one side though, so we make sure we can take those home with us in a handy shulker box, and I'm going to reset my bone block count to the 35 blocks or so I thought I had when we started this chunk originally. We'll bundle up the composter supplies, and now, my friends, it is time to begin the next chunk. I've taken a note of the time. We're starting this about 10:30 in the evening, so once I get to 11:30 I'll probably stop and we'll continue this another day. But we're back to listening to the screaming goats as we take off the top layer of snow here, and we're immediately exposing the one thing I think is going to be a bit of an unexpected hurdle with the pale moss chunk, and that is how difficult it's going to be to tell pale moss apart from stone. At least it's got a lot more texture than stone has. It's obviously got a lot more highlights, and it's got that ever so slight tint of like bluish green to it, but it's a very grey block. And my main concern was making sure that I could see which blocks were pale moss and which ones were stone when it comes to actually spreading this stuff. Because it sort of goes without saying that green moss is a very high contrast block compared to stone, right? It's going to stand out from the stone and make it very easy when you spread out the moss like this to tell which sections are covered in green moss and which ones are not. But then as you spread the moss around, you end up creating sections where maybe 1 or 2 stone blocks peek through, right? Because like here, for example, it hasn't spread perfectly to cover all of the available stone around it. So I came to the realization halfway down that moss chunk that maybe it was going to be a bit difficult to tell where there was pale moss and where there was stone. But from the looks of things, it's actually not too bad, purely because of the texture and the fact that there's grass growing everywhere. Naturally, pale moss is going to break with a hoe. It's going to break just as fast as regular moss does, so in terms of the actual speed of mining here, I don't think it's going to be impacted all that much. But I do have some folks in my community who've talked about being either blind or visually impaired, and I think that's going to be a consideration for you. If it's harder for you to determine the difference between pale moss and stone, you might want to use green moss, even if we ultimately decide that pale moss is a better block for moss mining with. Anyway, as we did on the opposite side, I'm going to dig down a niche here where we can place our composter so that can start turning the pale moss into bone meal as we produce it. And let's quickly talk about another consideration that we can make for this, allays. In previous moss mining videos, I've actually used a team of allays to collect all of the byproducts from moss as I break them and fill my inventory with other bits and pieces so that I don't pick up any of those blocks, and the allays running on a note block clock will drop off everything that I end up breaking down here and composting it for me, so that I don't have to think about the composting side of things at all. The allays handle that as a team. And once again, having pale moss as part of the moss mining equation is not necessarily going to affect that too much, but it does mean that you don't have to worry about assigning 2 allays to gather up all of the azalea and flowering azalea shrubs. Naturally, most of what you generate in either chunk is going to be the moss blocks and the moss carpet blocks, but with a team of 4 allays, maybe 5 if you want to count the wheat seeds in that as well, but you're going to find you'll have 2 spare allays who aren't going to be collecting any azalea shrubs from this side, who can be repurposed for the bulk collecting of moss blocks and moss carpet. Is that going to get the job done significantly faster? Not necessarily, but it'll certainly be a quality of life improvement because the whole area will feel a lot less cluttered with allays efficiently picking up all these blocks. So there's a little bit more to think about, and while a lot of this might seem trivial to some of you, I want to be thorough about this so we can decide permanently whether we're using pale moss for future digs like this. But to make that decision, I think I'll need a lot more experience with it. So I'm going to go get that experience now. I'm going to do this for another hour or so, and then we're probably going to end up doing the rest on another live stream. So I'll see you folks on the other side when we can check in and I'll be able to share some stats about this moss mining project. Hey folks, welcome back. So from one chunk over here to another, we have finally finished out this long project. We have mined out 2 chunks using moss and pale moss, and now I have some results for you. Right here, of course, is the slightly less important stuff, but the stuff I love to see anyway. All of the precious resources we dug out of this chunk. As you can see, still only 1 emerald ore from this chunk, but surprisingly, a few more diamond ore. That's just distribution, though. That's not anything to do with the fact that we mined it out using pale moss. That's just for me. That's just for me to have a few extra resources besides. So, having done all of this with pale moss, I can offer the following reflection on this. It's not going to matter much speed-wise which material you go with, because even though I was tripping over fewer azaleas and not accidentally growing them to knock down a couple of extra logs of wood, it took basically exactly the same amount of time to dig out this chunk than it did to the neighboring chunk. And once again, there are a couple of caves here and there, but nothing major, nothing that really stalled my progress. Even in some cases, slightly larger open spaces that meant I didn't have to bone meal all of the moss and break down a few extra blocks. So if anything, this should have gone marginally faster, but it was literally like 5.5 hours, exactly the same as the previous chunk was. So all things considered, I think it's pretty much whichever you prefer, whichever one you don't mind the aesthetic of, I suppose, with the green or the pale moss. I think they do differ slightly in terms of quality of experience, but it's really between whether you want to see a lot more of the stone patches and stuff in between the green moss, if it's a lot easier for those to stick out to you if you're using green, and you can put up with the fact that there's azaleas and stuff growing, versus the pale moss, which honestly got worse the further down I went, which was surprising actually. I was not expecting it to be a little harder to see down here next to the deep slate, but I think once again it is the texture. I think the fact that the pale moss has a bit of texture to it, and deep slate, and especially tough. Pale moss next to tough turned out to be relatively difficult to discern which was which. So I often found myself going back and bone mealing a couple of extra blocks of moss next to the tough to get rid of it because I'd missed one here and there. Overall though, that wasn't so much of an impediment to my progress here. The progress was much the same. However, here is where the two differ relatively significantly, and I don't think it's really accounted for by the occasional caves that we had in this chunk. But if you take a look in my inventory right now, we started once again with 35 bone blocks, about the same as we started with the previous one, and yet this chunk, the pale moss chunk, has generated, in terms of the return on bone meal, about half a stack fewer bone blocks. There is a half a stack deficit here, considering that we finished the moss chunk and we had almost 2 stacks. We had 64 here and 57 there, 121. This chunk has left us with fewer than 100. Between these 2 stacks of bone blocks, we only have 88 total, which is a pretty significant difference. And I don't think that's purely because of the azaleas not being there to compost, but I think it's got to have contributed a certain amount. I don't think the pale moss generates any additional carpets, and the grass that it generates aren't going to always drop seeds for you, so you won't always have extra stuff to compost, and seeds have such a low yield of compost anyway. But that's also another factor that could be a make or break when it comes to deciding which moss to make a bone meal farm out of, because there are automated farm designs out there that generate stone, bone meal some moss nearby to create moss out of the stone, to convert the stone into moss, then break the moss, put it all through a composter, and you end up generating a lot more bone meal than you use in running the farm. That's going to be more effective with regular moss, provided that you still compost all of the azaleas and all of the byproducts of the moss growing, compared to pale moss. It would be worth creating a pale moss generator to acquire the block, but I don't think it's going to give you the same return on investment with bone meal. For what it's worth though, I am very happy that I saved 2 shulkers worth of pale moss blocks, because I've gotten really attached to the block since I've been working with it. It is a decent grey block. It's got this slight greeny blue tinge to it, which sets it apart from a lot of the more neutral greys. And I do really like the moss carpet effect, the one where it kind of creeps up the side of a block and blends with the block. That appeared on some of the skulk blocks that we dug through in this tiny little deep dark cave over here. And on the side of Skulk, it actually genuinely makes the Skulk look like a very different block. It's kind of cool, actually. So I would expect that people will want to generate a bunch of pale moss in some sort of farm, and so I think in the next couple of episodes, maybe we'll look into moss farm designs, and we'll take a look at one of those that you can set up nice and easily in your world to generate either green moss or pale moss, whichever you would prefer. I also discovered, because there was a little bit of overlap between the moss I had generated in this chunk and some of the caves that were already present in this chunk, some of the moss had actually crept over the chunk boundary onto the other side, I discovered that pale moss and green moss will actually take over from each other when bone mealed. I can use this little patch of cave right here as an example, right? If I grab some bone meal here, make sure that none of the moss blocks around here have carpet on the top of them, and the same goes for the pale moss blocks over here. If I bone meal one of these, like so, there you go, it actually takes over that moss block there. Whereas if I make sure the carpets are removed from this once again, and I bone meal the green moss here, it takes over the pale moss side. So I'm actually considering making some sort of contraption out of this, not necessarily a contraption that would help to farm the moss, but maybe a game of sorts where you could, like, build it in a minigame district on a server and bet on which moss is going to win out between the green moss and the pale moss. If that's something that sounds like it'd be an interesting contraption to you, then let me know, because I'd be interested in seeing what kind of stuff like that we can build, even though I'm not really doing a whole lot of minigame building in this world because it's a world for just me. But take a look at this. We have a massive pit all the way to bedrock here now, and I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do with this. I might fill it with something in the fullness of time. Maybe we can come back here and build a really efficient mob farm that's built really far down in the world, and so the natural spawn algorithm is going to make stuff generate there as long as we take the roof off of this. Snowy biome, probably not the best place to have built that, but you know, we can figure out some solutions to that. The only other thing would be we have to make sure that it would be lit up in a pretty wide radius around here to make sure that we didn't get too many mob spawns. And also there's deep dark down there. So actually scratch that, we're not going to be able to do that at all. What we will be able to do is take home 2 shulker boxes worth of resources. And yeah, they do look surprisingly similar now that I compare them side by side. So that is a pretty safe indication of how much material we're going to be getting out of a single chunk of a mountain biome, surrounded as we are by goats, some of whom are screaming and some of whom are just relatively normal. I think we need to do a goat episode as well, because these are mischievous little friends, and we haven't done too much with goat horns aside from the occasional one that we've been able to snag from a pillager outpost. But fortunately, we still have 2 goats over here, one of which is a screaming goat, and the screaming goats are actually a very interesting case, so I'm very glad we have found one of those organically in this episode. For now though, my friends, from this little moss mining project we've done here, hopefully you got the info you wanted out of this if you were as curious about this as I am. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions, because I'm fairly certain I can provide a little extra data for you. In the meantime though, thank you so much for watching this episode. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care, bye for now.